Can you hear us now? Type yes.
Yay!
Oh crap. Okay, let's start. We just started, so let's start over real quick. So sorry about that. My name is Matt.
Make sure they can see the screen.
Yep, and I'm here with Samantha. You can see the screen, right? Okay. Cool. Sorry about that. My name is Matt. Do you hear what I hear? How patron bashing is killing our spirit. We want to start by telling you where we come from. So my name is Matt. I grew up in the UP, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I went to school at Central Michigan, studied philosophy, and like many of us philosophy majors or English majors, I became a librarian. Yep, that's right, our story. We got minimalist slides. So before I became a librarian, and more relevant to this conversation, is my first job here at my library was a security guard. So pretty much by definition, I was only dealing with those so-called difficult people, right? All day I was dealing with them. And even though I'm a very positive, optimistic type of guy, that's kind of my personality, I began to notice something about myself. Every time I would talk to my colleagues about the library, it would always be about the latest crazy patron story, right? And making fun of something that happened that day or that week or whatever. Whenever I talked to my family or friends, it was always about the latest crazy patron story, which is funny, of course, but I realized that this was happening with myself. I realized that there was something wrong with it, both morally and factually. And I realized that I was peddling this narrative about the library, that it's a crazy place with crazy people. So that inspired me. In the meantime, I became a librarian. That inspired me to sort of think about this phenomenon of patron bashing in a little more detail, and think about why it happens. And that inspired me to start giving talks like this on patron bashing. And giving these talks has really just concreted in me the idea that this patron bashing is a real big problem for libraries. It's a big phenomenon, and we've heard from a lot of people come and talk to us about it.
Hi everybody, I'm Samantha Minnis. I'm currently at Grand Valley State University, Mary Ida Pugh Library. I'm so excited to be with you guys today, and thank you so much for your patience during the technical difficulties. I want to just mention we are keeping an eye on the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer questions as they arise, so don't hesitate to shout out. We want to hear from you too. So my introduction to this topic really happened when I heard one of those talks that Matt just referenced, that he had presented about this concept of patron bashing, and it really struck me and resonated with me. I, like Matt, actually went to Central Michigan University as an undergrad, and when I was there, I started my library career as a young freshman in the document delivery office of Central Michigan University. And shortly thereafter, I started as a page at the local public library. And while those were wonderful and enriching experiences for me and ultimately set me on my career, I did notice this tendency to sort of tell stories about our patrons. When you first get to tell a patron story, it sort of feels like your badge of honor, like you're coming of age. It's a way to connect with colleagues. And I didn't really think much of it as I proceeded in my career. I did find that as I became more intentional about my career in librarianship, I came away from that a little bit. But it wasn't until I heard Matt present that I really started to think about this seriously and critically and about a problem in our profession. So what is patron bashing? What are we talking about when we say that? Now, we think it's sort of a behavior that if you've worked in librarianship, you've probably, or the library world, you probably know it when you hear it. But for the sake of our presentation, we're going to break it down into kind of 5 parts and talk about them. So the first kind, and probably the most common, is venting. That's when you maybe have a negative experience with a patron and it gets you really fired up. And so you go to a colleague and you just sort of like unleash the whole emotional experience using, emotionally charged language, and you just let it all out with the idea that you're sort of relieving that stress on yourself. So that's venting. The second kind is rumination. And that's when, after having a negative experience with a patron, you sort of keep turning it over and over in your head. You just can't let it go. You keep thinking about it. You maybe talk about it. You think about it that night when you go home. And maybe when you wake up in the morning, it's still on your mind. That's rumination. The third kind is storytelling. So that's sort of what we referenced earlier. When something happens at the library and you go home and tell your family members about it, or even when you tell colleagues about it, and maybe you have a specific story about a specific patron. It's also the stories that we tell ourselves about our patrons and how they behave and why they behave the way they do. The fourth kind is categorizing, and that's when we fit our patrons into categories or fit their behavior into categories. So I work in the academic sector of libraries, so maybe undergraduates are lazy, maybe faculty members are entitled, these types of categories. In a public library, where I've worked as well, you have, mothers who don't watch their kids and kids who are rowdy and things like that. The fifth kind is gossiping. And gossiping is where maybe you don't break any library policies about privacy, but maybe you kind of sidle up to a trusted coworker and give them a little information about an interaction you had with a patron that you probably wouldn't do in front of that patron's face.
So some of us, of course, are kind of thinking this. I mean, the reason we bash patrons is because they do crazy stuff, right? We're not making this stuff up. Yesterday at my library, someone puked on the floor. That's funny. We like to talk about it. And we're not here to deny the fact that sometimes crazy stuff like that happens. And we're not here to deny the fact that sometimes we have legitimate bad patron experiences, ones that are not okay. We're not denying that sometimes patrons get banned for violating rules of behavior, etc. What we're here to say is we think it's a much needed perspective thing. We need to put this into perspective that 1% of patrons are actually so-called bad or difficult or give us a really hard time or get banned. That is the perspective that I just think is desperately needed right now in libraries. In other words, we have to stop talking about these crazy patron stories because they don't represent patrons properly. We're very confident in saying that 1% of our normal experiences at the library are either going to be good or pleasant, or more likely they're just going to be dull, right? Unmemorable, things that you just don't remember. So if you don't believe me, a really good little experiment, if you want to be objective about it, is to just take a little tally a couple days. I did this a couple days myself, where you just have a little sheet. In one column it says good experiences, in one column it says bad experiences, and in the third it says neutral or blah experiences, and just see what you get from that tally. I wasn't surprised when I did it that I got a lot of goods, even more neutral experiences or blah, and I didn't get any negative experiences. So that's what we're here to say. We're here to say, we really need to stop spending so much time on this. I mean, even when you have staff days or even webinars like this and professional training, there's always at least one or two people that, the theme of the talk is dealing with difficult patrons or, emotional fatigue, stuff like that, which we're not opposed to, but you can't spend all your time talking about they're the problem and we're not. Sometimes we have to figure out that we're the problem, and patron bashing is part of that. So we're kind of left with this weird dichotomy where on the one hand, patrons really aren't bad or difficult. That's just the facts. But on the other hand, we bash them all the time. Every single day this is happening. We're gossiping, bashing, venting, ruminating. So what we want to know is why we do that. It's not like, of course, it's not like we hate patrons. It's not as simple as that. There's some deeper, more fundamental reasons that we think that this happens. So we're going to talk about that. And the first one, and this is a really big one, it's in psychology. This has been a well-studied phenomenon with how our mind works. It's called negativity bias. And it's very simple. It goes like this. We tend to only remember the bad or negative experiences that happen to us in a given day. We give them far more weight. We tend not to remember the really good positive things that happen to us, or we give them less weight. And the neutral experiences that happen to us during the day, or the blah experiences, we almost give zero weight to. They're, by definition, unmemorable. So negativity bias is a main defect that we need to consider to explain this whole patron bashing phenomenon. And it's really a blessing and a curse. Negativity bias was given to us by evolution because it has survival value. It has more survival value to remember that our cousin was killed by a lion rather than to remember that he was not killed by a gazelle.
Another reason why we tend to remember negative patron interactions disproportionately to the neutral or the good patron interactions is because of something called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is something that happens in psychology as well when psychologists are doing studies. They tend to notice the behaviors of the things that they're studying. Say they're studying mice. They tend to notice the behaviors that align with the hypothesis that the hypothesis that they believed was going to happen, rather than the behavior that maybe deviates from that. And lest you think you're immune since you're not a psychologist, we do this in our daily lives as well. Dr. John Gottman, who's a leading researcher in the field of relationships and marriage, has found that spouses who start out by believing that that their spouse loves them and wants them to be happy tends to notice the things that their spouse does that shows them that they love them and want them to be happy. Conversely, if you believe that your spouse doesn't love you or doesn't do enough things to make you happy, perhaps you tend to notice only the things they do, the missed opportunities to show you that they love you, the missed opportunities to show you that they're happy. So this is something we do where we pick a storyline and then we tend, through no fault of our own, to just naturally notice the things that fit into our storyline. And that's very much what we do with our patrons. When we have a narrative that we either want to tell ourselves internally or tell others externally, we tend to only notice the things that support our narrative.
So another heavily studied phenomenon in the field of sociology, which of course studies the way we act in groups, is another defect in kind of the way we think, and it's called groupthink. And it's pretty simple. It goes like this. If I start patron bashing to Samantha, she kind of just hears me, goes along with it. And then if Samantha in turn starts patron bashing to Julie or whoever, Julie also kind of just goes along with it. And that kind of thing spreads like wildfire throughout a group or throughout a work environment. It spreads like wildfire. It becomes a toxic work environment because nobody wants to be that person to stand up to their colleague or friend and say, I don't think we should be doing this. Maybe this isn't right. Maybe we shouldn't be patron bashing.
Another reason we perceive more negative interactions with patrons has to do with academic privilege. Now, this obviously is very relevant in the case of academic libraries, but it can happen in any library. It's the idea of the concept of privilege, where you have certain advantages that you didn't necessarily earn, that were just given to you because of your life circumstances. And because we, in a way, are highly library privileged, if you want to just make up a term there, we know the ins and outs of the library, we know how it works. A lot of our patrons don't necessarily come in with that knowledge that we assume that they should have. So when they're acting in a way that's different than what we would expect and acting in a way that's different than what we would hope for, we sometimes perceive that as a slight against us, or we perceive that as a negative interaction. And in fact, it may be a negative interaction, but it's caused by an underlying misunderstanding of expected knowledge.
Patron bashing reminds me of racism, and that's closely tied to classism, of course, in two specific ways. The first way is about stereotypes. So racism, as we know, is fueled and perpetuated through its false stereotypes about a group of people. People of color, for example. Black males are violent. Female black females are hypermasculine or lazy, or whatever stereotype you want to pick, but that is what fuels racism, and that is exactly what fuels this sort of patron bashing sort of thing. Patrons are difficult, patrons are dirty, patrons are stupid. All those stereotypes are not only false, but that is exactly what perpetuates patron bashing. So that's the way it's similar to racism. Now, the second way that patron bashing reminds me of racism is, frankly, when it is racism. In other words, sometimes patron bashing is just a convenient way to talk about people of color negatively. It's this coded language where I can make fun of, for example, urban fiction, wink, wink, nod, nod. I can make fun of that without, talking directly about black people and making fun of them. So that's another way. We at libraries, we know that people of color, minorities, they use the library, and sometimes they use it even more than other groups of people. So this is something to really think about seriously. And if you don't believe me, if you were to go to Google right now and just type in the words crazy library patrons, those 3 words, this would be one of the first hits. There's actually a lot of disturbing hits on the first 5 of them, but this one I found immediately. And what we have here is a pretty young white librarian. Whoops, sorry about that. Basically making fun of black people. This blog is filled with her, her crazy patron stories, her, woe is me, sort of, why am I working here, sort of a thing. But within 5 minutes of perusing this blog, you immediately notice the coded, toxic, negative language. Oh, sorry about that.
I think we could minimize it for just a second, maybe.
Yeah, we can minimize it. There we go. This coded language, and in this case, it's not very coded. So this is essentially a racist blog. Not to say that this person wanted to create a racist blog. Of course, it's not a conscious decision. It usually isn't. She probably just one day wanted to share her experiences right at the library and vent. She probably just wanted to ruminate.
Okay. So we're going to bring the little chat box back up here so we can make sure we can see you. But thank you for letting us know. Definitely keep us informed. So when I first heard Matt's presentation and he got to the slides, just a second. Yes, I agree, Andrew. I think that this problem goes beyond what we talk about to our colleagues now, and it has become part of almost a professional identity in some way. And so there are definitely books published on that. That's a really, really good point. So when I heard Matt's presentation and he got to those last couple slides, I thought, okay, wait. I'll admit it, I bash patrons. Sometimes I tell my crazy library stories, but I'm not racist. I'm not a bad person. I don't hate patrons. I love our patrons. I love my work. I just need to do this. I need to tell my crazy stories because I have to let off some steam. And we actually think that's probably the number one most common reason that people truly have for telling these stories, for their narratives and venting, is to try to relieve some of the steam of work. And so, but when you look at that idea of letting off steam, that's sort of part of our, of our normal vernacular and pop psychology. What it's really, where it comes from, is the hydraulic model of anger. And that actually started way back in ancient Greece with Aristotle, and the idea of watching or participating in violent sports to try to let off some steam of daily life. It was then further popularized and continued by Freud with the idea of catharsis. It's this idea that your mental health or your emotions are a closed hydraulic system full of steam. And if you don't safely vent that steam from time to time, the whole system could blow. And we do still see many examples of this in our day-to-day life. Let me just advance the slide here. Thank you. Okay. So this is an actual billboard from Missouri. Hit a pillow, hit a wall, but don't hit your kids. So the idea is you hit an inanimate object to avoid hitting your children, to try to release that steam, to release your anger so you don't release it on your children. How many things like this Wham-It anti-stress device that is like a punching bag or squeezy balls or things do we have to try to relieve that steam? So that's really what we wanted to investigate. If this is the number one reason that people say, and I think truly believe, that they are bashing their patrons, we wanted to really look into it. Is there anything helpful maybe about bashing patrons?
So that was really the point, the major point of us doing this talk. It wasn't just to, tell everyone what our thoughts and feelings and opinions are on this whole patron bashing thing. We really wanted to research it in the scientific literature, read these psychology journals that have been studying venting, rumination, bashing. They've been studying it for decades. So this is kind of our research part of the talk. And I mean, you guys can see the screen. I'm sure you kind of get an idea of what our results were. And, in full disclosure, we thought that there could have easily been benefits to venting and to venting with our colleagues. Maybe it's good for friendship, or it lifts us up, or, et cetera. So we certainly didn't expect the results that we found through reading these articles, which are it's bad. Patron bashing, venting, rumination. There is nothing really good to say about it when it comes to your psychology, the people around you, the people you're ruminating against. As you can tell by the titles of some of these articles, we read a lot more than this, but we wanted to give you a little flavor of some of these actual experiments, just to give you an idea of what they were like. So we'll start with the nail pounding experiment. So you can imagine, this is imagining venting as sort of this physical aggressive exercise, right? So you can think, if you thought like me that exercising, working out was a good way to sort of vent out your anger at your boss that day that yelled at you. So that turns out to be incorrect. So this experiment, they all have a similar structure, all these experiments. Phase one of the experiment is the people in the experiment get annoyed or aggravated or mad somehow. So they do something to them to get them mad. And then the second phase is the venting stage. In these experiments, they pounded nails, or you can imagine punching a punching bag. So it's simulating what venting is. And then, of course, the third phase of all these experiments is the most important part, the results. What happened? Which group was better off? Was it the group who pounded nails to vent their anger, or was it the group who did nothing? And all these experiments, of course, have a control group who do nothing. They don't punch the punching bag. They don't pound nails. So the results of these types of experiments are that you are far worse off for your psychology to vent in an aggressive physical kind of way than the people who didn't do that. All right, experiment number 2 is the angry professor experiment. So imagine there's a group of subjects that write this beautiful essay or paper for this professor. And what the professor does is totally tears it apart, right? Makes fun of it, D-, all these red marks on it. So that's the first phase. They're angered by that, by their beautiful paper getting ripped up. And then the second phase is the venting stage. So they had a group write about their feelings. How do you feel about the paper you wrote? How do you feel about what the professor said about your paper, etc.? So venting, right? And then, of course, they have a control group who doesn't do that, who writes about rainbows and pink ponies or whatever. And then, of course, the third phase of this experiment, the results, and the results were, you probably already know by now, but the people who vented were far worse off for their psychology than the group who did not vent. And not only were they worse off themselves, but when they were to rate the professor, like the next day, for example, they were much harsher on the professor than the control group who, wrote about rainbows and pink ponies. Had a more objective approach to rating the professor. And a lot of these experiments actually found that the time to just get rid of the anger, so we're talking about the control group who didn't vent, was as little as 10 minutes to sort of make that anger just vanish. So that was an interesting part. So experiment 3 is the story gets much worse. So not only does venting, is it bad for you, the person you're venting against, and the people you're venting with, your co-ruminators, but many experiments show that it's bad for what we would consider innocent bystanders. In other words, people who had nothing to do with the original, provocation, the original event that made you mad. So a simple example would be you go to work, you have a bad experience with your boss, you vent to your colleagues about that, you go home, your husband or your roommate has a big pile of dishes next to the sink, and you just take it out on that person in a disproportionate way, in a way that you really shouldn't. So this happens all the time, and that's what these experiments would show. And an interesting thing about these experiments is the time that it can last. So you can have a bad experience, and then you can ruminate, and then you can go home, you can sleep, you can come back the next day to the experiment, and then the experiment would annoy you in like a minor way, like in the experiments they call it a minor trigger. So imagine you're walking down a hall and someone just kind of bumps you. So even after all that time, you can take it out on people. So think about that for a second at the library. Where something bad happens to you at the library, you co-ruminate, you vent with other people, you go home, you sleep, you come back to work, a woman comes in with a child who's got Cheetos or whatever, and you just take it, you blow up on the patron, and that's an innocent bystander situation. So just imagine, Matt and Samantha, you're librarians, you cannot read, these complex psychological experiments, so you don't even take our word for it. We emailed one of the main researchers actually in this type of research. His name's Brad Bushman, but he was the author of some of the articles that we read, and we just emailed him for the heck of it. We said, there's this patron bashing phenomenon, what do you think about it? Do you think that there's anything good that could come out of it? And he said in very plain English that patron bashing and venting will only, quote, fuel the fire.
So based on our research and what we've read, we would like to propose a new model to replace the hydraulic model of anger. We would like to propose that anger evaporates. So instead of imagining your mental health or emotional health as sort of a closed hydraulic system full of steam, imagine yourself, if you will, as a pot of water on the stove. If you have a negative interaction, or if somebody turns up the heat on the stove, the water will start to boil, and eventually steam will rise. If you turn the heat off, given time left alone, the boiling stops and the steam dissipates. We feel that this is a good model to represent what we learned in the studies. The people in the studies who were the control group, who did nothing, who focused on something else, or did cognitive reappraisal, which we'll talk about in a second, found that their anger could be gone in as little as 10 minutes. Compare that to the 8 hours that happened in the innocent bystander study, where people could hold on to those negative feelings and react out of them in 8 hours. So when you find yourself in a situation where you've had a negative interaction with a patron, if you do nothing, even though it doesn't feel like it, our emotions feel so strong when we're having them, but they really are temporary, and they can go away in as little as 10 minutes. The other things you can do if you feel like doing nothing, I mean, that sounds sort of easy in a way, but it's actually quite challenging when you're experiencing strong emotions. You can focus on something else. As Matt mentioned in one of the studies, the focus groups, they focused on something else. They wrote a story about something they liked or about an activity they enjoyed. So sometimes just turning to a project at work that's going well, or a project that you really enjoy, a task that you really enjoy can help. Going for a walk with a colleague or talking to a colleague about something other than the negative interaction can be very helpful. Cognitive reappraisal is when you take the context of a negative interaction and you change it. So, for example, I think one of the most common negative interactions, you're working at a service desk of some kind, and somebody comes up to you and they're rude and they're short and they storm off, and you've done nothing but your best to help that person. You have a moment, even though it doesn't feel like it, to decide your level of reaction to that and to decide why that happened. And make no mistake, we do decide why that happened internally. We tell ourselves a story. We just don't always think of it as a story. We assume it's the right that we've landed on the right explanation the first time. So it's because that person was a jerk, or it's because they don't care about us, or they don't care about the library or what we're doing. But what cognitive reappraisal asks us to do is to change that context. So maybe instead of telling yourself that story, you say, wow, I bet that person's had a really hard day, and this is where they just lost their temper. And that, whether or not it's true, can help you sort of diffuse the emotional reaction you have to that interaction. So that's the great part, is it doesn't have to be true. Maybe that person is a jerk. You can't know. But the fact is you can't know. And so if you tell yourself a more positive story, it helps to calm those negative feelings that you're having. Now, constructive conversations. As we mentioned earlier, we in no way are denying that there are patron interactions that are truly troublesome, that are truly bad, and that need to be dealt with at a higher level. That being said, it's helpful to keep them in the perspective that they deserve to be kept. When you do find yourself needing to talk to somebody about a negative interaction you've had, one way to make sure that you're not just fueling your negative emotions is to keep your conversation really constructive. Think carefully about why you're telling this story. Are you telling this story because it's kind of funny, or because you're frustrated and you want to try to let those feelings out? Or do you need to talk to a supervisor because maybe you're not sure you did handle that conversation correctly and you'd like some coaching? Or maybe you were truly disturbed by it and you feel like that needs to be looked into a little bit further. Or maybe you feel like it is important that your colleagues know that of what's happening in a situation with a patron so that they can be prepared to best help that patron when they return, or to take whatever actions are necessary according to your library's policies. It's really important in those situations to just stay constructive, to sort of stay on topic, and to make sure you're not using emotionally charged language so that you can help to start to calm some of that anger you might be feeling.
When I think about dealing with, truly negative experiences, dealing with a bad patron situation, I like to think of myself as a stoic. Stoicism is just a beautiful moral philosophy. It's quasi-religious that we get from the ancient Greeks, started with Epictetus, and then later popularized by Marcus Aurelius in a book called The Meditations. But I really think it applies here, and it's even consistent with a lot of the science we read. But Stoicism has two main tenets. Number one, it's the control of our emotions with our mind, right? Sort of mind over matter. And I really think that's true. And that doesn't mean being emotionless, of course. Stoicism sometimes gets a bad rap for like not crying at a funeral or whatever. But it really just means controlling your negative emotions and embracing your positive emotions. So if you have a positive experience with a patron, embrace it. That's a good thing for you. But if you have a negative experience with a patron, try to control it either at the very moment it's happening, which is really hard for probably most people. You can't just shut off your emotions and not get upset. But right after it happens is when your mind can really work on those emotions to try to control them and let them dissipate. So that's tenet number one. Tenet number two in Stoicism is not worrying about those things that are not in your control, right? In fact, Stoicism says it's irrational to worry about things that are not in control, that are not in your control. It makes no sense. You have no control over whether a patron is going to give you a difficult time. Further, you have no control over, what situation that person was born in, what their family life was in, what their education was like. All those factors that makes us who we are as adults or human beings. You have no control of that. Only you have control over how you deal with it, with the customer service that you deliver, and how you react after these things happen. I also like to think of myself in sort of a more, religious way to deal with these negative situations as a sin eater. So the concept of sin eater apparently goes way back to early forms of religion where somebody apparently did something so bad that they could not forgive their sins or whatever through the normal traditional means, and they had to go seek out one of these sin eaters, and they would ritualistically eat their sins, and then they would be absolved. So I really do like to think of myself as when I'm having a difficult time with a patron, I really like to think of myself as eating their sins, as sort of taking on their burdens, because I just figure I'm in a privileged position to do that. So why not? Why wouldn't I? It's better for me. It's better for them. I can handle that burden.
Okay, so people are doing the best they can. Sit with that for a second. Think about whether you agree with it. Brené Brown, some of you may have heard of her. She's done a few TED Talks and she's written a few best-selling books. She is a researcher in the field of shame. And in, I believe it's her latest book, she found that there are some people who believe this phrase. They believe that on any given day, people are basically doing the best they can. And then there are other people who say, oh wait, no way, people can always do better, people aren't trying hard enough, people need to be trying to do better. And what she found is that people who believe that other people are doing the best they can tended to have more empathy for other people than people who believed that no, people can always be doing harder or be doing better and working harder. So when we are working at the service desk or working with colleagues or other patrons, I think we need to ask ourselves which we believe. And by embracing the idea that people are doing the best they can, it helps us to be in a place of empathy with our patrons, and it takes us out of a place of judgment. We stop seeing the situation as we wish it were, and we start dealing with the situation as it is. So we're meeting people where they are. Regardless, as Matt said, we can't control what came before in their life or in their day. And we can't control their level of academic privilege. We can only control the moment that we're in. And by believing that that person is doing the best they can with resources they have that day, it helps us to get there. Because the fact is, our work is emotionally taxing. So at work and in life, of course, we feel a whole range of human emotions, which is healthy. We're like Captain Kirk some days. But we expect ourselves to act like Spock. We expect ourselves to act like we're not feeling any emotions. And in fact, at work, it's even weirder because we don't expect ourselves to act like we're not feeling any emotions. We demand of ourselves that we act specific emotions, that we only act one very small sliver of the entire pie of emotions that we feel. So coming from the RUSA Guidelines for Behavioral Performance of Reference and Information Service Providers, we expect ourselves to acknowledge patrons using a friendly greeting and initiate conversation. We acknowledge patrons with eye contact, open body language, and a friendly greeting. But where does that leave you when you're not feeling any of those things? If you're feeling crabby or tired or sad because of either a patron interaction or because of just living your life as a human. And the difference between what you might be feeling in any given moment and making yourself act like this uses emotional labor to get from one to the other. And we all know it. That's why we go home at the end of the day sometimes feeling so tired when realistically all we did was talk to people all day. Talking to people all day can be exhausting, even when things go well. I would propose that by leaving, having that smile, that eye contact, that friendly greeting at the service desk, turning around and going back to a staff space and talking badly about patrons, and then expecting yourself to turn back around, slap a smile on, and go back out to the service desk is more emotionally taxing than trying to embrace a more holistic view. If we can leave some of that patron bashing behind, I actually believe we will lessen our emotional labor. So this is like the most used slide ever in any library presentation, and we know that. We've kind of embraced it at this point. But what we are talking about ultimately is good customer service. So we've been talking a lot about our own mental health, about our own psychology as library professionals, and I feel like that's really, really important. And it's important on a couple levels, because I want to see all library professionals be healthy and happy in the work that they do. But also because the work that we do and our level of health and happiness, I believe, is projected directly out to our patrons. Just as I was saying that I feel that if you internally don't go back and bash patrons or ruminate about patrons when you expect yourself to be smiling, I think the same is true of an organization. That what happens within an organization is what is projected outside of that organization to its patrons. Part of this is because the group that's most at risk for patron bashing tends to be your student assistants, your security guards, your library pages, because they have the most face time with patrons typically and are the lowest on the organizational chart and often have the lowest amount of input into library policies, and then they get the most patron feedback about those library policies. They also are new to the profession and looking for a place to fit in, and often that place to fit in, as we discussed, is telling your first crazy patron story. So by making sure our organizations are healthy and happy and not promoting patron bashing inside, we'll actually help improve our customer service. Additionally, if you're involved in any kind of user experience work or human-centered design, I feel that patron bashing actually can really shut that kind of work down, because the first thing you need to have to do that work is empathy for your patrons. You need to hear negative reactions. And you're right, yes, I know. It's true. Pages do bash patrons sometimes, and I think that's for all the reasons we've listed about their work that they do is very emotionally taxing, and then they hear it from others upward in the organization. So I think, as I said, having empathy for patrons is really important to offer truly great customer service. And if we're telling ourselves stories that patrons only complain because they're lazy, they don't want to learn the right way of doing things, they hate the library, then we're actually going to miss really valuable feedback. Even if it's given to us in a negative light, it can be really valuable for helping us improve our services and our spaces for our patrons.
So in conclusion, and start thinking about some good questions, we started off by just kind of giving, where we're coming from, our background, me and Samantha's background.
We talked a little bit about what patron bashing is.
And then I suggested that patrons really aren't bad, as a matter of fact, but what explains patron bashing? Why do we talk about them so much? And the first explanation was negativity bias.
We talked about confirmation bias.
Then we talked about groupthink.
We talked a little bit about academic privilege and racism and classism. We also talked about the myth of letting off steam and venting as a healthy way of dealing with negative interactions.
Then I suggested to become a stoic and or become a sin eater.
We talked a little bit about empathy and emotional labor and how that can affect the kind of customer service that we offer. We really believe, truly, that you have a choice, that we all have a choice. We have a choice about how librarianship is a profession, how library professionals treat patrons. We have a choice, even more powerfully, about what happens internally and how we interpret situations. We have a choice to not bash our patrons. So I see some people are typing, and we would love to answer your questions. Carol is asking, yes, about dealing with coworkers. Well, I would say, I'm going to go first, and Matt, jump in if you have other ideas. First of all, a good question is about proper. Depending on the level of propriety or lack thereof, if you're talking, let's just start with patron bashing. Let's say they're not doing anything really like breaching policy. Okay, it's not policy. So if we're talking about like maybe they bash patrons, there's a couple ways to deal with that, and it can be a little tricky, and I know Matt has some experience, so I'll let him speak in a minute. But I think the first thing to remember is what's really powerful about the idea of people are doing the best they can is that your coworkers are also doing the best they can, and that you are doing the best you can. So starting from a place with empathy is really important. Also understanding, both in yourself and others, that you've probably been dealing with negative patron interactions this way the entire time you've done this, and you've witnessed it modeled for you the entire time you've been working in libraries, or even any customer service field, really, because this definitely goes outside of librarianship. And so being patient with yourself as you try to recognize that behavior and move forward into a healthier way of dealing with it. And Matt, I'll let you tell your stories about.
Yeah, so yeah, it's the most important question is how do we deal with coworkers patron bashing? You can give them, of course, sort of the silent treatment and hope that you're not being complicit in patron bashing and hope they sort of get the idea, but stop doing it yourself is number one. I mean, that's a powerful and amazing first step. There is a way to deal with your colleagues' patron bashing in a non-judgmental way, and we all know what that means. I mean, people are smart. They're going to know whether you're judging them condescendingly, like I don't patron bash, but you do, you're worse than me. They're going to know if you're doing it that way, or they're going to know if you're doing it in an empathetic way. So I'll give you, my experience was sort of like this. I started doing this research on patron bashing. My colleagues that sit next to me sort of were asking me questions. I gave this talk at my library. So I became sort of the patron bashing guy at my library. But I was also not judgmental about it. People are going to do this. I do it sometimes still. So my story, actually a really good story, was with one particular colleague of mine. She sat right next to me, and she was sort of really defending patron bashing. She really thought that it was necessary to sort of lift her up, as she put it, and she kept saying that phrase, that my coworkers have to lift me up when a patron has broken me down. So we had a lot of really good debates and discussions about it in a friendly way. And, a month or so later, she went up to me and said, you know what, Matt? I really don't think venting is good for me. And I'm not making that story up. It really happened. I mean, it's not like it doesn't happen anymore. Like, it's not like the people that work with me don't patron bash. It happens every single day. It's a big problem. But at least they know where I stand on it, and that they know that I'm not judgmental about it. And I think that helps a lot.
I don't think I saw any other particular questions. Oh, I did want to mention an idea that was brought to us one time when we did this presentation, particularly for people like pages or people who do a lot of staff work, and that can be reference librarians too. It's anybody who's doing a lot of patron FaceTime. One manager said that when she sees people doing patron bashing or sees people starting to lose their tempers or lose their patience, she tries to give them breaks from the desk. Even like she'll step out on the desk for a few minutes and give them a break. I think it's important to remember that we're all human and doing the best we can, as I've said numerous times. And offering, when you're in control of a situation like that, try to offer breaks for your colleagues. Try to be mindful of what people can actually take when you're scheduling desk shifts. It's great to think that somebody could be on the desk for 6 hours, but I think we all know that's impossible. So trying to incorporate rest when possible, being mindful of your staff's breaking points and needs, and emotional needs as well as, physical needs is really important. I'm so glad people are getting so much out of this. This is wonderful. If anybody has any other questions, we're happy to take a couple more.
Yep, I think we have at least 5 minutes or so. So and don't be afraid to be, critical. Do you think we're sort of blowing this out of proportion? What about social media? Yeah, I mean, my example I think was perfect, and the crazy library shit website. That's not just one website. There's many like crazy library patron websites, which is sort of like social media. But yeah, it's all part of the phenomenon. It's promoting this idea, which is just so pervasive in the library profession, and not just the library profession. I mean, this happens in service industries. I used to be a barista at a coffee shop. The same thing happened. But yeah, do you have anything to say about social media?
Just that I think it makes it easier to complain about anything more anonymously. And so I noticed somebody mentioned the book about a complaint-free world or something, which I think looks really great, and I want to look into it. But I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, somebody had a really good question about, yeah. Okay, so that is not something, finding a positive spin on a patron that paints with their feces on the restroom wall. Thank you for bringing that up, and I will tell you why. Because no, we're not going to tell you to find something positive about that. Because there is a point at every library where you have to enforce your policies. So the other part of the people are doing the best they can thing from Brene Brown is that people who believe that and are highly empathetic also have very strong boundaries. And at first, Brene Brown couldn't really reconcile this. How can you be somebody who's highly empathetic and say, this is exactly what I'll give to you and no more? And it's because when you believe people are doing the best they can, you stop expecting them to change. So I realize, Gwendolyn, thank you for being patient. I'm kind of circling back around in a long way. But so personally, in your personal life, if you're being empathetic, you also set your boundaries because you're meeting people where they are instead of where you wish they were. So you say, I'm not going to let you treat me a certain way. And I believe that as libraries, our policies are put in place when they're put in place properly with the same empathetic feeling. We are dealing with our patrons as they are. Somebody who is doing that, who is causing, a danger to other patrons, a health risk, you have policies in place to deal with that. So you should enact those in however your library chooses to do so. The difference is you don't necessarily go around telling that story as an example of how all patrons are wild or crazy or weird. What you can do is enact your policies. If you catch the person doing that, you ban them, or you do whatever needs to be done in that situation to stop it from happening. And you don't have to put a positive spin on it and say, what a joyous part of my library life dealing with this. We all have to deal with troublesome moments like that. And there is a point at which we say, you cannot treat the library like this, and we are asking you to leave. It's just important in your conversations regarding it to stay constructive and stay about the policies instead of that person's maybe mental health or issues that they are having.
So yeah, people have accidents, they poop their pants, that's just like normal, that happens. So in parents, some parents are bad parents, whatever, some kids didn't grow up, but the point is that has nothing to do with patrons. There's nothing special about people that enter the library that make them bad parents. I've yet to see a shred of data or anything that would suggest that. So, like Samantha said, loud kids with parents, it's a rule thing. It's a rules of conduct thing, and that's a really tricky one. We've went back and forth at our library with how much we deal with kids yelling and when do we kick them out, and that's always a tricky situation. But, yeah, like I said, it had nothing to do with how patrons are. It's just a particular person. We had another good question right after that. When I meet, you work at the library. It's a peaceful place. I think it is a peaceful place. I guess that's my answer. I'm going to leave it at that. I think it's a peaceful place to work. It's a peaceful place to come to the library and get books. So I guess I would be honest and say it is.
I disagree. I think libraries are bananas, and that's why I like to work at them. But I think there's a difference between disabusing somebody of that notion. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons to disabuse someone of that notion. I work in an academic library, and we very purposefully have made the first 2 floors of our libraries loud places, not just not quiet places, very loud places. So just talking, I think that gives you an opportunity to talk about the wonderful things that libraries are doing as a place of the future, in addition to what I think is very important is trying to provide a peaceful place. And really quickly, I think we're running out of time, but Andrew, that's a really, really good question and something I would like to talk about a little bit more and do a little more research on. If I had to make a quick educated guess based just on the top of my head and my experience, I would say the only difference between those groups of people, if there is a difference, because I think this largely has to do more with your level of, I don't want to say emotional intelligence because that makes it sound like a ranking system, but the exposure you've had to ideas of mindfulness or of your emotional intelligence, even as a concept, as opposed to like an inherent thing you have. But I think the only other difference is that some of those people you list probably purposefully picked this career, and other people sort of ended up there. And I think that when you purposefully picked it, and I know I'm making sweeping generalizations, you have a heart for it, as opposed to just like this is your 9 to 5 and you go and you clock in and you clock out. That being said, I think this is an area that everybody can grow in. I've seen degreed librarians who struggle in this area, and I've seen high school educated clerical staff who have nothing but the best of heart and empathy for patrons. So I don't think that there's necessarily a breakdown in those areas unless it's correlated to maybe opportunities for professional development. That's my very quick answer.
Okay, any last minute questions? Carol? I think Amber will let us know when we're done. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to thank Matt and Samantha for this fabulous presentation. I know I learned a lot today. Everybody who attended the session today will be receiving.
Thank you so much for all of your positive feedback, and if you have more questions, feel free to contact us. I think Amber has our contact information. It's also at the beginning of our slide. I'm at Grand Valley, Matt's at Kalamazoo. We would love to hear from you, hear how this works for your library. If you show it to other staff, if they have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We really, really appreciate your attention and your patience today, and thank you all so much for your time. Great day.